In the Middle East, we see a different story than we necessarily see in Africa or in India, because a lot of these areas became colonies, um, or we call them colonies. Um, they acted like colonies, but they were really like protectorates that were established within World War One. So they were controlled by Europeans later on. So a lot of times these places achieved independence fairly non-violently, but then the leaders who were put into power were not the leaders that were chosen by the people. They were capitalist supported autocrats, meaning they were basically dictators. Um, the people did not have a lot of power. Voting was not necessarily happening, and this is true both in Egypt that became independent in the 1930s, except for the Suez Canal zone, which was controlled by the British and partially the French, and in Iran. Iran became independent in the 1950s, and in 1953, the CIA um, put into power a Western favoring Shah. This was important because Iran had a lot of oil. Now, this Shah was very pro-Western and very anti-conservative Islam. So he would do all kinds of stuff that would really bother the religious people in Iran, such as, drinking alcohol and, excuse me, promoting a very Western lifestyle, just very inflammatory to them. And so in the 1970s, as part of this very large Islamic revival movement, uh, which we see continuing to this day, the wanting to restore conservative Islamic principles in countries such as Pakistan and, Saudi Arabia, all over the place. The 1979 revolution is a part of that. The 1979 revolution brings in Ayatollah Khomeini. Who is technically semi-divine. And he comes into power and kicks out this Western Shah, and we'll go into more of that with Chapter 38, the ramifications of that for the United States. And this 1979 revolution is why we still have a very tense relationship with Iran. Egypt, we have a very close relationship with relatively, became independent in 1952, became independent prior to 1952 in 1930. But like I said, the West controlled a lot of the government and the West controlled the Suez Canal. As a response to that, again, as part of this Islamic revival movement, the Muslim Brotherhood, which was founded in 1928, was seen as an alternative to the military Egyptian regime. They had a big program for social uplift and reforms. They were big partners with unions, medical clinics. They encouraged strikes and riots against the powers that be. Stemming from that same idea, although not necessarily a part of the Muslim Brotherhood, is Nasser. And Nasser, you can see him here, came into power as a autocrat and basically a coup in 1952. And he took power from as part of the Free Officers Movement. And This was part of a military takeover. He put in tons and tons of reforms. He redistributed lands to Arabs. He instituted more education. He subsidized education and made it a lot cheaper for Arabs. And he also increased employment. By 1980, 30% of employment in Egypt was government-based. He also took over the Suez Canal from the English, and that was seen as a very big move, an anti-imperialist move. And then he also built the Aswan Dam. This huge dam was meant to help out with agricultural output. And really, while it did help with agricultural output, because of the increases in Egyptian population, it didn't really give the gains that it was supposed to. In addition to that, it was kind of a failure because the standing water that it developed lots of parasites. So that was bad. Nasser was a big proponent of Pan-Arabism, and this was the idea of the Pan-Arab League that would unite for Arab interests against Western domination. And the Arab League still plays a big role in the Arab world today. And as you can see, it covers most of North Africa, the Middle East, and also the Horn of Africa. But does not cover Israel, obviously. And here's the Aswan Dam on the Nile River. Okay, coming back to Israel. Israel was a state created in 1948 by the United Nations, partially in response to the Holocaust. Jews had been moving to Israel for a long time, but after World War II, the British, who had the mandate in Palestine, were really ready to hand it over for independent government. And that, combined with the Holocaust, resulted in the United Nations being the one who was going to divide up this country. So as you can see here, the UN proposed, and what was put into place in 1947 was a two-state solution, where Palestine would be divided into Arab lands and Jewish lands. This was the plan. Now, when that happened, when Israel gained independence, and even before that, there was a huge outcry by Arabs. They thought, you have to remember that the United Nations was mainly Western nations, and they thought that this was imperialism. But the Holocaust had shown the West that basically, like, the argument from Jews was that they needed a safe place. They needed this space, this country, this homeland, and this was their biblical homeland. So this should, or excuse me, not biblical, but this was their ancient homeland. So this was the land that they should have. And that convinced the United Nations, and the rest of the world was very sympathetic. But again, make no mistake, like right from the beginning, even before the state was established, it was contentious in the Arab world. And when the partition happened on that Independence Day, there was war immediately between Israel and Arab states. And Israel had the backing of the West, and so they had a military might that was far beyond their small size. And they were able to gain a lot of territory from these wars. And Arabs continually, or not continually, but over a period of years, kept attacking Israel. And so today, what we see in Israel is not this two-state solution. It is something far different, where Israel controls the majority of the land, and Palestinians' land is much, 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 much smaller. And a lot of that land has also been eroded by settlements. And because of that, there is a large population of Palestinian refugees who are making their claims to the United Nations in support of their political rights. And also, there's been outcry for Jewish settlements. So politically, not in the United States, but especially in places in Europe, um, this this is a very current and extremely relevant topic. The statehood of Palestine and Israel, and this is still one of the Israel issue is still one of the largest issues in the Arab world today. So this is a very current and changing issue, which we'll talk more about in class. Continued challenges. In terms of civil rights, both women and religious minorities' rights continue to be challenged. And there's a number of different opinions on this. It's definitely not a homogenous opinion that women are suppressed or not suppressed. But again, we see in the West, we tend to see things as, women need more rights, and so do religious minorities. Because of the Islamic law in these states, however, that does not always happen. Here are some women surgical staff in Iran. Okay, one of the biggest problems in the Middle East is the boundaries, the arbitrary boundaries. These are set up with Kurdish, you see this a lot in Iraq, Sunni, and Shia populations. And we know that those types of groups have different objectives. So especially in places like Iraq, we see a lot of conflict there. There are also autocratic governments. These are definitely not true democracies. And there's not a lot of voice for the people. Export economies, they're reliant on oil, and so during the recent oil price crash, that resulted in a lot of issues for these regions. Also, it resulted in them sometimes cutting back on production and sometimes pushing forward with production. And then Cold War rivalries definitely played a role in the formation of these states and the types of governments that they came up with.